I'm broke and I ain't got a dime. I'm broke and I ain't got a dime. I'm broke and I ain't got a dime. Everybody gets in hard luck sometime. I was standing on East Cairo Street one day. I was standing on East Cairo Street one day. I was standing on East Cairo Street one day. One dime was all I had. 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 Trying to be a sporting lad. I bought the morning news, Lord. I bought that morning news. I bought that morning news. And I bought me a cigar too. I'll play it while I smoke this cigar. Oh, baby, I'm all out and down. Oh, baby, I'm all out and down. Loving, baby, I'm all out and down. I'm a stranger in your town, Jackson, Tennessee. I'm broke and I ain't got a dime. I'm broke and I ain't got a dime. I'm broke and I ain't got a dime. Everybody gets in hard luck sometime.
And the name of that is?
That's the One Dime Blues.
One Dime
Broken ain't got a dime.
I was trying to factor for inflation. What all did he do with that one dime now? There was a cigar and the news?
Yeah, bought the morning news, and he bought a cigar too.
Okay.
That was, you can tell that was a long time ago.
Well, I can
That was
remember
back in the 1920s when they had 5-cent cigars.
5-cent cigars, it goes back how far?
1920s.
1920s.
So
I can remember, you can get a cup of coffee for a dime.
Yeah.
Buddy, can you spare a dime? But I thought, if he got a cigar in the morning news.
Yeah, there was a blind man, Blind Lemon Jefferson, that composed that. So he bought the morning. He was trying to be a sporting lad,
Yeah, with the dime.
Holding up the newspaper and smoking a cigar.
I made a mistake carrying a couple of dollars into the coffee shop thinking I could do something recently, and it doesn't work anymore. Had to get out of the charge card. Yeah. We're going to take a trip to the Delta and the North Delta and everything else with Dr. David Evans, and it's an extraordinary pleasure to welcome you and to welcome him to Studio 6 here at E+ TV 6. He spent 38 years with the University of Memphis. Prior to that, was in California. He was actually born in Massachusetts.
That's right, yeah.
The last place your folks would expected you to wind up.
I lived in Texas for a few years, too, when I was young.
And what did your folks do in Massachusetts?
My mother was mostly a housewife. She did a little interior decorating work, and my father was an auditor for Prudential Insurance.
Okay. Were you ever able to explain to them what you were doing in this life?
They were sympathetic and supportive.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, it was an odd choice to study folklore and folk music in the 60s. There was very little academic support for it in the way of courses and programs, but I found a sympathetic program at UCLA. That's why I moved to California, and they saw me through to the PhD level, and academic jobs were still possible to get back
with some tenure and benefit, right?
In the late 60s, the universities were still looking for faculty members. Now they get 50 strong applications for every
Every
job
that's out
that
there.
opens up.
Were there many people doing this?
There were not too many academic people because,
Okay.
as I said, there were not many programs that really took an interest in folk music. The music was all art music, European classical music. Even ethnomusicology was interested in North American Indian music if they were interested in any kind of American music, but not black or white folk music.
So what
And
triggered
so-
your interest then? in this
Well,
stuff?
there was popular interest. There's the folk music revival that was going on
in the early 60s
In
then?
the early 60s, indeed. And at that time, I was at Harvard University. Cambridge was a hotbed of the folk movement. You know, we had coffee houses and everyone was coming through. The first artist I saw was Sleepy John Estes from right here in Brownsville.
Is that right?
Him and Hammy Nixon, yeah. 1962, they had just been rediscovered, and the Jazz Society of Harvard sponsored a concert a little bit off the jazz track, you know, but blues and jazz were related. So I went. I heard of Sleepy John. I had heard one of his old records reissued and went to see him. That was the first blues I ever saw live.
Okay. So Sleepy John Estes and Hammy Nixon from Brownsville, Tennessee, at Harvard.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And
That had to be difficult for people in Haywood County to understand as to what they were doing.
I imagine it was. John lived in extreme poverty, and he probably his social reputation, you know, as a blues singer, not working steadily, you know, drinking, being up late at night, and living from one gig to another, you know, it was pretty low, you know, his standing. And yet here he was traveling all over the country, eventually all over the world, Europe, Japan. And it was, I'm sure the local people had a hard time to fathom it.
Say that Sleepy John Estes is in Paris, France, or is in Tokyo, Japan.
And
Apparently, we were at a session recently that was sponsored at the Delta Heritage Center in Brownsville. And one of the writers there from Japan, right, talked about what a great hit he and Hammy Nixon were. And that
I
people
guess
were waiting on him at the airport when they returned.
Being blind, they have a tradition of blind singers and musicians in Japan. It's a kind of specialty activity that many blind people take up. And so he sort of fit into that mold of venerated cultural figure. And Hammy told me, I later got to know Hammy quite well and played music with him for the last 5 years of his life. But Sleepy John was already deceased. But Hammy told me that 2,000 or 3,000 people met them at the airport in Tokyo when they landed. So they were stars.
A long way from a shanty shack or whatever in Haywood County, Tennessee, to 3,000 people waiting for you in Tokyo.
Yeah. I mean, you can go to the Delta Welcome Center in Brownsville and see the shack that he lived in. I mean, just two-room shotgun house. Yet he could be a star in another part of the world.
So you're in Massachusetts, and you're living in Massachusetts, from Massachusetts. You're at Harvard, and you hear them. And then what happens to you then as a result of that?
Well, I got more interested and found that other artists were appearing in town, in Cambridge and Boston, mostly at coffee houses. And so I could go to see them, Fred McDowell, Brownie McGee, Sonny Terry, Son House, I got to know him, Booker White, who was living in Memphis. They were all touring, Skip James, Mississippi John Hurt. So it was a great place to be to see these artists, these legendary artists. They were mostly in their 60s by that time.
Okay.
Yeah, of course,
But seeing there was
quite
one
young.
thing, this becomes a life passion for you, a life work.
Well, it did. I was able to interview Booker White and Son House and another singer named Babe Stovall up from New Orleans while I was a student at Harvard, and I was collecting records, reading books. I mean, at that time there were about 3 or 4 books on blues. There was one British magazine that you could subscribe to. I began subscribing to that. And there were about 25 LPs generally available.
Okay.
And you could get all those and the books and subscribe to the magazine. And in about 2 months of absorbing all that, you were an instant expert. You knew as much as anybody did about the music and its history, you know, and what was, at least what was written about it.
Well, let's go back to the coffee house for a moment. Can you play something that you would have heard in that day and time, or John or son? Or?
Well, let me see. Let me think about that. Gosh. I'd have to retune to play that one.
Okay.
Well, Mississippi John Hurt, he played this piece. It was a ballad about a poor boy, a boy that kind of went wrong, left home and got in with bad company and got killed. In fact, his name was Lewis Collins. Miss Collins weep, Miss Collins moan, to see her son Louis leaving home. Angels laid him away. Angels laid him away. They laid him 6 feet under the clay. Angels laid him away. Tom shot 1, St. Louis shot 2. They shot Paul Collins, shot him through and through. Angels laid him away. Kind friend, now ain't it hard to see poor Louis in a new graveyard? Angels laid him away. Angels laid him away. They laid him 6 feet under the clay. Angels laid him away. When they heard that Louis was dead, all the people they dressed in red. Angels laid him away. Angels laid him away. They laid him 6 feet under the clay. Angels laid him away.
And that was Mississippi John.
Yeah, that was one of Mississippi John Hurt's songs.
So you hear this stuff, you're drawn to it, and there's not a lot out there. And did you know then that was going to be a life's work, or did that just evolve for you?
Not really. I was a student. I was studying Greek and Latin, in fact, and probably. I mean, I was interested in a academic career, you know. So I probably would have been a classics instructor, you know, a scholar. But I got more interested in this music, folk music, and tried to figure out a way to make a career out of it. And I got some advice from a young postgraduate fellow at Harvard who had gotten his doctorate in the field of folklore, and he advised me to go to UCLA and their folklore program, and I thought that they'd be sympathetic to my interests, and it turned out that they were. And by the time I finished up there, there was a job waiting for me at Cal State Fullerton, one of the branches of the
Okay.
state system in the anthropology department, teaching folklore and
Okay.
ethnomusicology. So I managed to slip into academia that way, and gradually the folk music became a more respectable academic field.
Folk music as you define it, is what?
Basically, traditional music, songs that are passed on in a kind of oral tradition. I mean, somebody, of course, composes them originally, but they normally aren't written down or set in a fixed form. So they vary. Sometimes even the same person performing them at different times, and then as others learn them, they.
So then, as someone involved in academics, then you start trying to document this? Is that part of the function of this?
Well, yeah. Blues, of course, especially interested me, and the beginnings of blues historical research, trying to sort of reconstruct how the music had developed, really got underway in the late 1950s. So I was almost on the ground floor
right place, right time,
of that. There was really very little known in the 1960s, but some of the artists who had recorded and been influential earlier years were beginning to be rediscovered, those who were still living. And then, of course, there were many who had never recorded. They were fine artists, but they lived in some place like Brownsville or somewhere that was just off the beaten track of the recording industry. Sleepy John got lucky. He went into Memphis and got discovered there, got to make his first records.
When would he have done that? What year?
That was 1929.
1929, so he's early.
Yeah.
What was driving the recording industry then to pick these people up? A market for this?
There was a market. They realized that in 1920, a very aggressive black songwriter and band leader, Perry Bradford, persuaded a small record company to record one of his songs. He said he would supply the singer, Mamie Smith, provide the accompaniment with his band, and doing one of his songs. And the company took a chance on that to basically to see whether they were figuring the market would be in the African American community. And in fact, there was a market. It was right after World War I. There was a wave of prosperity and urban migration, and many black people in the cities bought the record. And of course, that led to more records, and more African American artists came to record. And
in those days, how did they hear the records then?
Well, they would get they were not being played on radio at that time. Just word of mouth. At the stores, there were record stores, and then one person would play it, somebody with a Victrola, and friends would come over and hear it, and they would want it for their Victrolas. I mean, the fact that there wasn't black music, or hardly any, on the radio, radio was just coming in the early 20s, but it was very white and very mainstream. So the fact that it wasn't on the radio made the records all that more desirable to have.
We're heading from the 20s, the 30s, 40s into the 50s, and then it changes things. And I guess John Lee, Sonny Boy Williamson here, because he worked with Sleepy John.
Yes.
They were all together.
He was probably influenced, I think, his vocal style a little bit, and probably his songwriting influenced by Sleepy John Estes. They certainly knew each other. Hammy Nixon, the harmonica player, was kind of a mentor to Sonny Boy Williamson. And Sonny Boy moved to Chicago and became quite famous, more so than Sleepy John had been, and on into the 1940s. In fact, he was a leading figure in Chicago blues in the late 40s when unfortunately he was killed. It was a mugging, coming back from a gig in Chicago. And
I have felt that had he not been murdered, that when these British groups were discovering all these people from Chicago and everything else, he would have been a real key figure.
Oh yeah, he would have gone on through the 50s, I think, and been along with Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf would have, I think, remained a leading figure. And if he'd lived into the 60s, which he easily could have, I mean, he wasn't that old, he probably, would have started doing collaborations with the Rolling Stones,
like Johnny Hooker and all these guys.
like Muddy and Wolf did.
Dr. David Evans is with us, 38 years with the University of Memphis. This is the first book that he wrote as part of a series on Tommy Johnson. Who was he?
Tommy Johnson was a blues singer and guitarist from Mississippi. His home was Crystal Springs, Mississippi, a little south of Jackson. And then he went up into the Delta to pick cotton and play music in the fall, as many musicians did, and ran into blues musicians there, Charlie Patton, Willie Brown, and learned their style, and then brought it back to Crystal Springs and Jackson and spread that blues style there. And he got to make records too in Jackson through a local talent scout that had a music store, and his records were fairly popular and very good examples of folk blues.
Why did you want to write about him?
Well, many other singers learned his songs, and I ran into a couple of them early on. Babe Stovall, one of the first artists I interviewed and recorded, knew Tommy Johnson and played a couple of his songs, and Babe led me to another singer named Roosevelt Holtz, who had known Tommy better. In fact, his cousin married Tommy Johnson, and and then I got interested in Tommy Johnson's tradition. I noticed that these other artists didn't play his songs the same way Tommy Johnson had recorded them. They had their own variations of them, and Tommy Johnson himself seemed to be part of a tradition. His songs shared certain verses and musical ideas with other blues by other artists in Mississippi. So I said, well, there's a tradition going on here, and I thought I would explore it. Tommy had only been deceased since 1956, and so it was 1964 when I met Babe Stovall, and then started doing field work in 65, 66, 67, and I met two of Tommy's brothers, who were both guitarists, and many others.
Have you got a sample of his work?
Yeah, I have to tune one string down here. This is his Big Road Blues. This is probably his most famous song. Ain't going down this big road by myself. I ain't going down a big road by myself. Now don't you hear me talking, pretty mama, crying. I ain't going down a big road by myself. If I don't carry you, gon' carry somebody else. Crying, my baby got ways like a fox squirrel in some tree. Now don't you hear me talking, pretty mama, crying. My baby got ways like a fox squirrel in some tree. she see me coming, run and hide from me. Crying, you ain't gonna do me now, like you done poor Shine. Now don't you hear me talking, pretty mama, crying, you ain't gonna do me like you done poor Shine. Take the poor boy's money, sure Lord won't take mine. Crying, how come you do me now, like you do, like you do, don't you hear me now? How come you do me like you do, the way you do me, break my poor heart in two. Crying today has been a long old lonesome day. Now don't you hear me talking, hear what I say? Crying today has been a long old lonesome day. And I believe tomorrow be the same old way. Crying now, what you gonna do when your trouble get like mine? Now don't you hear me talking, pretty mama, crying, what you gonna do when your trouble get like mine? Get your pick and shovel, ease on down the line. Crying, the sun gonna shine in my back door someday. Now don't you hear me talking, pretty mama, crying, the sun gonna shine in my back door someday. The wind gonna change, gonna blow my blues away.
Dr. David Evans with the work of Tommy Johnson. We will be right back with more as we continue. Studio 6 here at E+ TV 6. Welcome back into Studio 6 here at E+ TV 6 as we continue a visit with Dr. David Evans. 38 years at the University of Memphis studying folk music, folk artist, and a lot of this in the Delta. Prior to that, in California, went to UCLA or
UCLA.
UCLA.
Yeah.
I forgot which one of those out there, and
Graduate
was from
school.
Massachusetts originally.
Yeah.
But met, when he was at Harvard, met Sleepy John Estes and Hammy Nixon from Brownsville, Tennessee, performing up there, and heard them, and then gravitated into this work for his life, and is documented through extensive research generations of people about whom we would not know had people not been out
Well,
there.
son, there probably, I guess I could say there wouldn't be much known about Tommy Johnson if I hadn't done that research. Certainly, he was a very important blues artist in Mississippi.
I wanted to ask you about retuning that bass string there,
Yeah.
or the top string. Is that the way he played every song, or just on
no,
a
just
few?
well, this is in the key of D,
Okay.
and the string normally in standard tuning it would be in E, but you tune it down to D, and then these
so it has an octave
these two
to it.
strings
Okay,
are in parallel.
octave. Okay, all right.
Yeah, because E is not a very useful note in the key of D.
D, okay.
So.
So it adds to the resonance, and so
Yeah,
you're playing all six
yeah, it
strings.
makes a
with
lot
this.
of things easier to play.
to do. Okay.
It's like that, you know.
So when they were composing all of this, and I guess out of life experience and other things, they become their own innovators then.
Yeah, they, of course, you know, they're
Because you're
coming
working that
from
guitar pretty hard. I mean, this is not just strumming here. You're
No, it's picking.
Very intricate,
They're coming from a tradition, of course, and they see, well, except for the blind artists, but they see and hear others playing and get ideas, and then do variations on them or add things, take things away, and you know, and of course some compose very original songs. Sleepy John Estes was a great songwriter, as was Sonny Boy Williamson.
I find it fascinating that Greg Allman covered that Swingin' Bridge song on one of his more recent
Floating
albums.
Bridge, that was
Floating Bridge, yeah.
the Sleepy John. Hammy told me about that.
Okay.
Hammy was driving then. They were going up to a recording session in Chicago, and it was during the 1937 flood in Hickman, Kentucky, and there was a bridge. I think it wasn't the Ohio River, but it was a tributary, and it was, he called it a floating bridge. I don't know if it was a bridge that sort of lay on the creek or the river somehow, and they would drive across it, but at any rate, the water was up and the car washed off it. And
I was listening to NPR one day, and they had Greg Allman on there, and he was talking about this album, and then and they played his arrangement, and then they pulled up Sleepy John Estes, which had to go back generations. And you wonder how do you find how does Greg Allman find this song or want to record this song? It's pretty interesting how all of it interconnects and continues to resurface.
Well, of course, Sleepy John almost drowned. He said, "I never will forget that floating bridge. They tell me 5 minutes underwater I was hid."
Okay.
And they pulled him out, and and I guess I don't know whether the car was salvaged or what, but they got to Chicago and he made up a song about it and recorded it.
I mean, it's just amazing stuff because it transcends generations. When you got into this, what did you discover out there? You kept pursuing this. I mean, something.
Well, I probably had somewhat romanticized ideas of the blues and blues singers. It was a
In what way?
tough. Well, just it came to me just as pure music, pure sound, disembodied from its cultural background. But of course, as I got to
So you're in a coffee house at Harvard, and you go, "Hey, this is
But then as I got to meet some of the singers, and especially when I started doing field research in the South, you realize that the blues singers are many different personality types. Some were the sort of, I guess, stereotype of the blues singer, the ne'er-do-well, the person who's just out for good times and drank a lot of alcohol and wasn't very responsible. But others were quite responsible. They had day jobs. They were weekend warriors, so to speak, as musicians. Some treated it as a kind of business. Some took care of themselves, their health, moderated their drinking, and some were very, very nice people. Others, just every type of person. The blues seem to have something for every type of
person.
personality.
One thing you mentioned in this, in your work, is that when you go to interview people, some that used to perform this music, if they had found the Lord, so to speak, or had gotten into church or whatever, they totally would disengage themselves.
Yes,
it's an either-or thing, not a both-and.
Yeah, Tommy Johnson, for example, his two surviving brothers, one was still playing blues, although he had a day job. He worked at a boiler plant, and he just mostly played for friends by that time in the 1960s. His other brother had become a preacher, still played guitar, but only sanctified tunes. His old musical buddy, blues buddy, Ishman Bracey, had become a preacher and was Reverend Ishman Bracey by the time I...
So they didn't find a way to blend this. You have to do one or the other almost.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, a blues player would usually have a few church songs that they'd play for family members or on request. Now, blind musicians could get away with doing both. They were given a certain indulgence because that was how they made a living. Playing music.
So he's only playing this because he has to.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it gives you a buy.
Yeah,
Okay.
it did. And
that discussion continued.
They were sort of the medium, you might say.
That discussion continued into rock and roll with Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis and all these. Can you play this music and still go to heaven? Kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. There are many preachers, especially in the earlier years in the 20s and 30s, called it the devil's music. And
what makes Delta blues to you? Is there a defined Delta blues to you? And then this stuff that we have out of Haywood County, is that Delta blues or is that?
Well, that's a hard question. There's a kind of Mid-South or Deep South blues, and at least in the old style, again, it's the clearer back in the 20s and 30s. It tends to be very intense in its performing style, even the themes of the songs. They deal with very deep emotions, deep subjects, and also kind of minimalistic. Some would say simplistic, but it's not that easy to play. It takes a while.
Got an example?
But you get the maximum out of every note of singing, every word. Everything's meant to be heard. There's not a lot of passing notes and chords or filler material.
Got an example?
Well, I'll play a piece. This is another one. This is supposed to be an arrangement that Tommy Johnson made. He never recorded it, but Prison Bound Blues. It was a big hit of Leroy Carr. He was a popular blues singer and pianist in the 20s and 30s. And so this is supposed to be Tommy Johnson's arrangement, as I learned it from Roosevelt Holtz and some others. Well, it was soon this morning when the blues come falling down. It was soon this morning when the blues come falling down. I was all locked up in jail, Lord, I'm prison bound. Crying all last night, I stood in my cell alone. Crying all last night, I stood in my cell alone. Just thinking about my baby, Lord, in my happy home. Baby, you may never see my smiling face again. Baby, you may never see my smiling face again. Ah, baby, but always remember, your daddy has been your friend. Sometimes I wonder, why don't you write to me? Sometimes I wonder, why don't you write to me? Well, if I've been a bad fellow, I did not intend to be. When I had my trial, baby, you could not be found. When I had my trial, baby, you could not be found. Now I'm all locked up in jail, Lord, I'm prison bound. Here come the warden now. Lock me up and throw away the key.
So that's Delta blues.
Well, yeah, I mean, it
sense.
was in Tommy Johnson's style.
It seems
they
pretty intricate in many
played-
ways, and down on the the rock and roll, it takes a while to get back down into that. I mean, that they were ahead of the curve. It seems to me in many ways.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, the music, it sounds old, but in some ways modernistic too. And
In the folk tradition, then, if you take this music of the Delta and then you take what was happening up in the mountains of East Tennessee or whatever, are there similarities or Kentucky in this hillbilly music?
well, blues had a lot of appeal to the Southern white audience and musicians. Many of the Delta, West Tennessee blues artists that I met and interviewed said that they often played for white folks. If it was on the plantation, and they had gotten a reputation as a musician. The white people were curious to hear the local star, so to speak, and especially if they'd made records. And of course and then white hillbilly performers started recording blues too. They would meet singers, sometimes hoboing on, they'd find themselves in the same boxcar with a black musician, or railroad workers coming through towns up in the mountains
So
who were
cross-pollination,
musicians. They would meet, and in the towns and cities, Nashville, Knoxville, So, Jimmy Rogers, the famous blue yodeler. Hammy Nixon told me he met Jimmy Rogers hoboing.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, and they played together.
Well, okay, so they played together. So they
Yeah.
found so Jimmy Rogers, and then if you get Robert Johnson or something, if you could blend them, it would be there.
I mean, they of course would reinterpret the music in terms of their background in country music, hillbilly music, as it was called then, and so it would come out sounding a little bit different, but still they absorbed some elements of blues for sure. And as time went on, say by the 1950s, I think Southern white musicians were gradually had become more comfortable with blues. So people like Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis could emerge sounding, really like blues singers. I mean, they were white, but they had really absorbed so much of that feeling. Elvis was very popular with black audiences when he first
started.
Came out. If you look at the R&B charts for, say, his first 10 years, you'll find that he's one of the top 10 R&B artists in terms of record sales,
he
right
absorbed
along
a lot of
with
that
Fats
stuff.
Domino and B.B. King, and
Michael Baker, with whom you've worked here at the library, and for 20 years brought together the talent for the Shannon Street Blues Fest when we did it. And the thing that always amazed me was it would be anything from a one-man band or a jug band or whatever, then into Rosie Leday came here out of Louisiana as a Cajun singer. That blues, and I went to the Blues Awards one year, and I don't know how many categories are. I mean, there's acoustic blues and traditional,
quite a few,
and all this other stuff. Is it connected? Is there a connection there amongst all this when you look at it academically?
Oh yeah, sure. The blues. I mean, it probably started out as a type of folk music. The solo performer, a male singer with guitar or at a piano. The female blues singers didn't accompany themselves as much. Some played piano and a few played guitar, but usually they would have a male musician accompanying them. And then, of course, in usually urban settings where there's a little bit more money or more of a cash economy, little ensembles could form, guitar and harmonica,
so it was
jug bands.
So economics
bands.
of the audience to a certain extent.
Right. Would determine
what you could
the
do.
format.
But the music, then you find connections.
And then of course with when records started coming out in 1920, you get a rapid development or an evolution of new styles because the record industry always feeds on novelty. And then of course radio also. As blues became popular music, they needed new songs, new styles. So whoever had the new thing had greater possibility to become popular.
When you look at our culture today, the audience for this is, at one time I read that Alligator Records said that 70% of their sales probably were to Caucasians rather than African Americans.
Well, by the 1960s when I got interested in it, there was much greater white interest in blues. There had been some in the 50s as a result of rock and roll. Most of 50s rock and roll was blues. It just wasn't called that. But by the 60s, something called blues was being recognized by American whites, and they began buying records, and of course that's when I got caught up in the music myself. And in the meantime, black music, popular music, was changing. It had still largely been blues through the 50s, and blues was still fairly strong in the 60s in the black community, but soul music, kind of gospel-influenced soul music was getting big. And then by the 70s, when you're talking about with Alligator Records, the 70s and 80s, funk, disco came in, and then hip-hop, and these styles got further and further away from blues. And while the black interest declined and diversified into other types of music, the white interest in blues grew, as well as the international interest.
Is it locked then into the past?
Well,
I mean, because it was a reflection of life, right?
Blues has not stylistically has really not evolved much since the 1960s. There's now a whole
So
new
you've had
cast
Allman
of
Brothers,
characters.
these are the people that start covering this stuff,
for
right?
the last 50 years,
Yeah.
you listen to artists today, no matter what style they're in, and you can find that sound, that style, existing back in the 60s. And over the years since that time, of course, more and more artists have begun exploring historical styles like I do, you know, going back to the 20s and 30s, including many black artists. I mean, black blues has not disappeared by any means. And in fact, it too has both has a contemporary aspect and there are younger artists that are exploring historical styles too.
Talk about your work. You've got several books, one on Tommy Johnson that you can order from Dr. Evans, and then Rambling on My Mind, and then Big Road Blues. What are these works?
Well, Big Road Blues was, of course, I played Big Road Blues, the song. It's one of Tommy Johnson's songs. It's, while Tommy Johnson was his life and his songs, Big Road Blues is a book about the blues tradition, how it works, how singers compose songs, how they learn songs, how the songs are transmitted and varied, and it centers on the tradition that Tommy Johnson was part of, but it looks at a lot of other singers besides
What about Rambling
him.
on My Mind?
That Rambling on My Mind was a book that I edited. It's a collection of essays by various scholars. Some of them are academics like myself. Some of them are just
You also have a host of
non-academic scholars. I've got an article in there about blues nicknames. and
Okay, so just more fun stuff. and
different
some, things.
subjects. I think fairly, I'd say high level, but readable scholarship about,
all right,
about
readable
different,
scholarship is-
different topics about blues.
Several CDs, and these are collections of your work.
Those are ones of myself. Yeah, I have 3 on an American label, Inside Sounds label of Memphis, and then 2 on a German label, Blind Lemon Records. I tour a lot in Europe.
Okay.
In fact, I'm going there in late April.
Where can people find these?
Amazon.com. There are a few stores in Memphis that have them, but the best place would be Amazon, or catch me at one of my gigs. I've always got my bag full of merch.
So you're still touring and still working?
Yeah, oh yes, I am. Yeah, I've made 70 tours overseas, and I've got one.
All in Europe, or you go elsewhere in the
Europe
world?
and South America.
Okay.
I did a few gigs in Ethiopia. Yeah, I've played in 22 countries.
Okay.
So, and I was in, last year I was in Germany and Czech Republic on one tour, another one in France and Belgium, and the third tour was in Venezuela.
Okay, all right.
So,
Terry Harmonica Bean was here at the library a few years ago. He said they started trying to pay him in shekels. He said, "No, I want American money."
oh,
went to
no,
Israel,
you know, you take the local currency and you can convert it,
He said, I don't know about the shekels. He said,
I
he said he thought they were saying shackles at first. He said, no, I don't want any of those either.
No.
You got a song you
he
can.
must have toured in Israel.
Yeah, he was in Israel. Yeah, he said he was in Israel. He said, which was fascinating to go from Mississippi and to be able to play this all over the world.
In Europe, I like euros, because you can go from one country to another and it's the same currency.
It's been a delight to visit you. I appreciate the opportunity to do this.
It's been a pleasure
just
to
a
be here. I
fascinating-
always like to
fascinating
come back
history.
to Jackson and Brownsville, and I kind of feel like I got started in this part of Tennessee.
Delta Heritage Center at exit 56 on Interstate 40. Sonny Outlaw and the people there have done a remarkable job. Webb Banks, late Webb Banks, that was mayor there, got that started. And it's a great showcase, I think, of what Delta history is. And now the Tina Turner Museum and Sleepy John Estes House, it's just a real unique repository, I think, of things.
I did the text for the placards that are up in the Sleepy John has about his life and his music. And
Got a song that we can send it home with?
Yeah, well, I could do one of Sleepy John's. Do it. I used to do this with Hammy. This is Brownsville Blues. John recorded it. Is the girl I love. She's got long curly hair. Well, I'm going to Brownsville, go take that right-hand road. Well, I'm going to Brownsville, take that old right-hand road. Well, I ain't gonna quit walking till I get in my rider's door. Well, the woman I love, she got some great long curly hair. Well, the woman I love, she got some great long curly hair. Well, her mama and her papa, they sure don't allow me there. Well, you see my jumper hanging upside your wall. Well, you see my jumper hanging upside your wall. Well, you tell by that I need my ashes hauled. Well, I rolled and I tumbled and I cried the whole night long. Well, I rolled and I tumbled, cried the whole night long. I got up this morning, found my baby gone.